They tell you in training that the cold is not your enemy. The cold is just weather, they say. Your enemy is the thing that lives in it. I believed that right up until the night the ice cracked under our convoy and dropped 4 good people into water that closed over them like a fist. After that, I stopped believing much of anything except the weight of the rifle on my back and the count of rounds in the magazine, and even those let me down before the end. My name doesn't matter anymore. I was a field medic, 2nd class, attached to the evac column that was supposed to pull the last of the survey teams off Caro's shelf before the migration season turned the whole moon into a grinding plate of moving ice. We were 3 transports and 40 souls when we set out across the white. We were 1 woman and a sidearm with 11 rounds when the rest of this story starts. I have done the arithmetic of that gap more times than I can stand to remember, and it never comes out to anything but the cold and the dark, and the things that the cold and the dark are full of. So let me start it properly. You should know the moon before you know what happened on it. Caro's shelf is a frontier world the company never should have touched. It orbits a sun that's been dying for 10,000 years, throwing off just enough heat to keep the surface a slurry of glacier and exposed rock, never enough to make it anything a sane species would call home. The survey teams came for the mineral seams running under the ice, rare conductive or the refinery's upsystem would pay blood for. What they found instead was that the ice was not empty. Nothing on that moon was empty. The cold was full of things with teeth, and the things with teeth had been there a very long time before us, and they did not care what the company paid for ore. We'd been warned about the pack hunters, in the way you get warned about anything you've never actually seen, a line in a briefing, a grainy image, a survivor's account that the people writing the report clearly didn't quite believe. The survey logs called them sabers, for the obvious reason. Twin fangs longer than my forearm, curved like skinning knives, growing down past the lower jaw in a permanent threat the animal didn't even have to mean. But the fangs weren't what killed you. I want to be clear about that, because everybody fixates on the fangs, and the fangs are almost beside the point. What killed you was that they hunted in coordinated packs of 9 to 14, that they could read the heat coming off your living body through a meter of packed snow, and that they did not stop. That was the thing about them I came to understand too late, and it is the thing this whole story turns on, so hold on to it. Once a saber pack locked onto a scent trail, it followed that trail until either the prey was dead or the pack was. They did not get tired. They did not get bored. They did not weigh the cost the way every other animal in the universe weighs the cost. A wounded saber would crawl after you on shattered legs because the pack was on the trail, and the pack did not break. They had no concept of cutting a loss. To them, a hunt abandoned was not a defeat. It was something worse than a defeat. It was a wound in the order of things, a tear in the logic that built them. The pack survived by never spending more than a hunt was worth and by never, ever throwing good strength after a lost cause, and so the pack always finished what it started, because to the pack there was no such thing as a lost cause. There was only the hunt, and the hunt ended one way. That logic made them perfect. It also in the end made them smaller than us, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The night the convoy died, the lead transport went through a stress fracture none of the sensors caught. The shelf had been booming under us for hours, those deep cannon-shot cracks that travel for miles under the ice and come up through your boots like the moon clearing its throat, but we'd convinced ourselves the route was rated and the rating held. It didn't. The lead went nose first into a meltwater channel that the survey map swore was solid, and the 2 transports behind it piled in trying to break on a surface that gives you nothing to break against. I was in the 3rd. I remember the world tilting past the point where tilting becomes falling, the scream of metal folding, and then black water coming up through a split seam in the hull like the moon itself had finally opened its mouth and decided to swallow. I got out because I was near the rear hatch, and because a man named Das put the flat of his hand against my back and shoved me through the gap before the cabin filled. I never saw Das again. I have spent a great many cold nights since then thinking about the arithmetic of that, that he spent the last whole second of his life on the simple geometry of getting one more person clear of the water. He didn't say anything. There wasn't time for anything. He just put his hand on my back and pushed, and the water took him, and it didn't take me. I didn't ask him to do it. I would have told him not to. He did it anyway. Remember that too. It comes back around. When I came up out of the channel and dragged myself onto solid shelf, the sun line was already going down behind the western ridges, and the temperature was falling like a dropped stone. 40 souls had started across that ice. I lay on my back in the snow and I counted the heads I could see. I counted them 3 times, because the first 2 times I could not make myself believe the number, and the third time gave me the same answer as the first. 1. Just me, soaked through to the bone, with a sidearm and a medruck that had floated free of the wreck and washed up against the channel edge beside me like the moon was being polite about it. 40 people. 1 ruck of bandages. The math of that day was already insane, and it hadn't even started being cruel yet. And then over the wind, I heard the crying. It wasn't human. I knew that the instant the sound reached me, even half drowned and shaking so hard I couldn't have held the sidearm if I'd tried. It was higher than a human cry, stranger, with a warble underneath it that no human throat makes, a kind of trilling break in the middle of each wail. But it was unmistakably the sound of something very young and very frightened, and it was coming from the wreck of a survey sled half buried in the drift about 40 meters off. A sled that had not been part of our convoy at all. I should have walked away. Every line of my training, every instinct that had kept me alive long enough to be standing on that shelf, said the same thing. Move, find shelter, get dry before the cold takes your hands, and then your judgment, and then the rest of you. The crying was not my problem. The crying was, if anything, one more predator on a moon that already had too many. Instead, I went toward it because I am a medic, and because 40 people had just gone into the water in front of me, and because I think some animal part of me simply could not stand the idea of letting one more living thing die alone in the dark that night. It was not a decision I'm proud of or ashamed of. It was just the only direction my legs would carry me. What I found in the wreck of that sled was a cub. It was a saber. There was no mistaking it, not even in the failing light, the spotted slate-gray hide, the oversized paws an animal grows into, the 2 fangs already pushing down past its lip, even though it could not have been more than a few weeks old. Its eyes were the milky blue-white of a thing that hadn't yet fully learned to see. It was wedged into the overturned cabin of the sled, and beside it, filling most of the space, was the body of an adult saber, an enormous female, cold and stiff, with a survey team tranquilizer dart still buried to the flights in the muscle of her shoulder. I understood the whole grim story in one look. The company had been running a live capture op. They darted the mother for a specimen, loaded her onto the sled, and then the sled had gone through the same treacherous ice that killed my convoy, and the mother had drowned or frozen in the wreck, and the cub had survived in the air pocket under the overturned cabin, pressed against the cooling body of the only thing in the universe it knew, crying into the black for something that was never going to answer it again. I want to be honest about what I felt, kneeling in that wreck. I felt the cold logic of survival, and the cold logic spoke very clearly. This is one of them. This species kills survey teams. This thing in a year will be 150 kilos of muscle and instinct and knife-edged bone. Leave it. Better than leave it, end it, quickly and cleanly, and remove one future predator from a moon that has too many already. That was the sensible voice. That was the voice that had kept me alive. I knelt there in the freezing wreck with my hand on the grip of the sidearm, and I listened to it lay out the whole reasonable case. And then I looked at the cub crying against its dead mother, and I could not do it. I'm not going to dress that up as wisdom or mercy or any other word that makes it sound like I knew what I was doing. It was not a calculation. It was the opposite of a calculation. I had just watched water close over 40 people I'd eaten breakfast with that morning, and somewhere in the last several hours I had reached the absolute limit of how many things I was willing to watch die. The cub was on the wrong side of that limit by about 90 seconds. If I'd found it before the convoy went in, I might have done the sensible thing. I didn't. I found it after, and so I holstered the sidearm and I reached into the wreck and I picked it up. It was freezing, colder than a living thing should be, running hot under my glove one moment and shivering cold the next, the way the very young do when their body has lost the thread of regulating its own temperature. It pressed its face into my chest and went silent, the warble dying in its throat, and I felt the small, frantic drum of its heart against my ribs. And I thought, with the gallows humor that was the only thing that ever kept any of us functional out there on the frontier, outstanding. I am the last human being on the shelf. The company owes me 40 funerals it will never pay for, and now I am a wet nurse to an apex predator. Truly an exceptional posting. Then I felt the heat coming off the top of its skull, and the humor went out of me, because I realized the cub was sick. It had a fever, a bad one. I could feel it radiating off the dome of its head through the wet fur, could feel the way its breathing had gone shallow and fast, the way its body was burning through what little reserve it had. Half-drowned, hypothermic, in shock, orphaned, and now a fever fighting all of it at once in a body too young to carry the load. I had a medruck and 20 years of human medicine packed into my head, and not one single page of any of it written for this animal. I didn't know its chemistry. I didn't know what its fever even meant, whether the numbers that would kill a human meant anything at all to whatever ran under that gray hide. But fever is fever. Heat is heat. Whatever the biology, a brain cooking inside the bone of a skull is a brain being destroyed, and that much is universal, and I had cold packs. That decision, that one small, stupid mammal decision, made by a freezing woman in the wreck of a sled on a dying moon, is the hinge the entire rest of this turns on. So pay attention to it, because at the time it felt like nothing. I broke an instant cold pack out of the ruck, the chemical kind that goes frigid the moment you crush the inner sleeve, and I wrapped it in a strip of thermal cloth so it wouldn't burn the skin, and I held it against the top of the cub's skull where the heat was worst. I held it there in the wreck of that sled while the sunline died completely, and the dark came down, and the temperature on Caro's shelf dropped to a place where exposed skin freezes solid in under a minute. I built what shelter I could from the wreckage. I got the cub dry. I got its body warm everywhere and cold, only cold where its skull was burning. I held that ice pack to the cub's head through the whole long black middle of that night, my own hands going numb around it, talking to it in a low voice about nothing, about DOS, about the 40, about the math of the day, because talking kept me awake and awake kept us both alive. And somewhere in the deepest part of that night the fever broke, the shallow fast breathing slowed and deepened. The frantic heat under my glove faded to something warm and steady. The milky blue-white eyes opened and found my face and held on it, and the cub stopped being a problem I was solving and became, in the space of one held breath, something I was responsible for. There is no walking that back once it's done. I have tried. You can't. I named it nothing. You don't name them, that much training stuck. But I thought of it as the cub, and after a while I thought of it as mine, and the difference between those two things turned out not to matter at all to the things that were already, even then, moving toward us across the ice. The pack found us on the second day. I had known they would. I'd known it the moment I picked the cub up, if I'm honest, somewhere underneath the part of me that didn't want to know it. A saber pack reads heat and scent across kilometers of open ground, and I was a fire of living body heat dragging a sledge across open white, and the cub was theirs. Their kind, their scent, their blood, their lost young being carried away across the ice by a heat source that was not one of them. There was no version of this where they did not come. I understood it the way you understand a storm coming by the color of the sky and the smell of the air, not as a thought but as a certainty in the body. Every saber on that shelf was converging on the trail I was laying down, and I had 11 rounds and a medruck and a child that wasn't mine. And behind me, spreading out across the white in the slow, disciplined crescent of a hunting formation, they came. There were 11 of them. I counted the way I count everything. It's a sickness. 11 sabers, every single one of them larger than me, moving with the patient, lethal economy of animals that have never once in the entire history of their species failed to bring down what they hunted. They did not charge. That is the thing people who have never faced a real predator always get wrong: the charge, the roar, the dramatic rush. Real hunters don't do that. They pace you. They take your measure across a distance you can't close, and they can. They let the cold and the exhaustion and the fear do their work for them, and they bring the crescent in slow, and they wait, with a patience that has nothing human in it at all, for you to make the one mistake that ends everything. I made for the only terrain on that whole flat shelf that gave me even a prayer, a broken ridge of pressure a kilometer east, where the shelf had buckled and folded against itself into a maze of blue-walled canyons, too tight for the pack to flank me inside, narrow enough in places that they'd have to come at me one or two at a time instead of all 11 at once. It was a bad plan. It was a plan that ended with me dead in a canyon instead of dead in the open, and I knew it. But a bad plan you can act on beats a good plan you can't. And so I dragged the sledge with the cub lashed to it into the mouth of the ice, and I put my back against a wall of frozen blue older than my entire species, and I waited for the dark. They came that night, and they came every night after, and I will not walk you through all of it. Some of it I genuinely don't remember. The cold does that, folds hours into a white blank, and the parts I do remember I would rather not lay out in detail, because there were things I did in those canyons with a sidearm and a med scalpel and a meter of broken sledge rail that a younger and softer version of me would not have recognized as my own hands working. I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. I will tell you that I learned the pack's great strength was also the seam in its armor, because they would not break off a hunt, because the concept did not exist in them. They would walk into a place a smarter and more cowardly animal would have made them pay dearly to enter. I funneled them. I used the canyon mouths the way a man uses a doorway against a crowd, and I made the geometry do the work my 11 rounds couldn't. The first night the big lead male sent 2 of them in at the narrowest point, and I put a round through the throat of the first and broke the second's foreleg with the rail as it tried to climb the wreck of its packmate, and they pulled back to reassess, and a smarter species would have reassessed all the way to the next valley. They didn't. They came again an hour later, because the cub's scent was in the canyon and the hunt was not finished, and to leave was unthinkable. I dropped 3 of them across those first 2 nights. 3 sabers for which I have no pride and no shame, only a tired accounting. And for every one I dropped I burned rounds I could not replace and strength I could not get back, and the magazine got lighter in my hand, and the cold got down into my fingers until I could barely work the slide, until I was loading by feel and by faith because I couldn't feel the rounds anymore. The med scalpel went dull. The rail bent. My world narrowed to the mouth of the canyon, and the blue dark beyond it, and the patient packing shapes that the dark was full of. And through every minute of it the cub watched. That is the part that stays with me, more than the killing, more than the cold. Through all of it the cub watched me from the sledge, wrapped in the thermal cloth, its fever a memory now, its body filling out on the protein paste from my ruck, its eyes gone from milky blue-white to a clear hard sharpness that took in everything. It watched me kill its own kind to keep it alive. It made no sound while I did it, and I had no idea, none, what was happening behind those eyes. I told myself in the gray, exhausted hours between attacks that the answer was nothing, that it understood nothing, that it was a weak-souled animal running on pure instinct, and there was no more thought behind its watching than there is behind a stone. I needed that to be true. It made the killing bearable. I was wrong about it, but not, as it turned out, in the way I was afraid of. On the 3rd night, I ran out of rounds. I need you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it, there against the ice. 11 rounds, 11 sabers, and after 3 nights the arithmetic had finally, inevitably, come all the way due. I did 8 in the pack when the 3rd night started, and I burned them in the first hour driving back a coordinated rush at the canyon mouth. 2 of them came in low while a 3rd tried the wall above me, and I emptied the magazine, breaking that attack. And then the slide locked back with that small final click that is the loudest sound in the universe, and the sidearm was just a cold, dead weight of metal in a fist that couldn't feel it. And there were still 6 of them out there in the blue dark. 6. Packing. Patient, whole, unbroken in body and unbroken in that terrible logic that did not know how to quit. I had a dull scalpel and a bent rail and 2 hands that no longer worked and a child behind me on a sledge. And I sat down with my back against the ice, because there was no longer any reason to do it standing up. I thought about Das. I sat there in the killing cold with 6 apex predators between me and morning, and I thought about the flat of his hand against my back and the simple geometry of his last second alive. And I thought, all right, so that's what this is. If this is the end of it, then it's the same trade he made, just slower. One more weak thing gets clear of the water at the cost of the strong thing carrying it. I dragged myself back upright on legs that didn't want it, and I put my body squarely between the mouth of the canyon and the sledge where the cub was, and I gripped the bent rail in both ruined hands, and I waited for the cold or the fangs, whichever reached me first. I did not expect to see the sunline again. I was, in every way that mattered, finished. And the pack did not come. I don't mean they left. I have told you what they were. Sabers do not leave a hunt. The leaving does not exist in them. I mean that they came to the mouth of the canyon, all 6 of them, flowing up out of the dark in the formation I'd come to know, and then they stopped. They stopped at the edge of the blue light, and they held there, and the lead, the big old male, the one with the scar that split one of his great fangs down the middle, came forward alone into the canyon mouth. He did not look at me. That was the first wrong thing, the first thing that didn't fit. He looked past me down the length of the canyon at the sledge, at the cub. And the cub stood up out of the thermal cloth. It stood up on legs that were steadier and stronger than they'd been 3 days before, and it lifted its head and it warbled at the old male. The same warble I'd felt come up through my own ribs that first frozen night, the trilling break in the middle of the cry. And the old male went still. Not the still of a predator gathering itself, not the coiled stillness before a strike. I knew that stillness intimately by then, and this was not it. This was a different kind of stopping. This was an animal encountering something its world had not prepared it for, and having no idea at all what to do about it. Here is what I have come to believe happened in the canyon mouth that night, though I will never know it for certain, and I have had a great many cold years to turn it over. The pack had been running a scent trail for 3 days. The scent was their lost young, and in the only frame they had, the only logic their world had ever given them, a strong heat source dragging the scent of their lost young across the ice could mean exactly one thing: a thief. A rival predator that had taken the cub and was carrying it off to eat at its leisure. The strong take the weak. That is the first and only law of the cold. A strong thing carrying a weak thing of their blood across the white was a strong thing carrying off a meal, and the pack had come, night after night, to take their young back, and to make the thief pay for the theft in the only currency the cold accepts. And then in the canyon mouth, they finally got close enough to read it properly. Close enough to see that the cub was warm, that it was fed its belly round with paste from my ruck, that it was healed, the fever long gone, the body filling out instead of wasting. Close enough to see in the wreckage of my position, the 3 dead packmates and the burned-out empty weapon and the bent rail and the blood on the ice that was not all theirs, that the thief had been wounding itself and starving itself, and dying by degrees for 3 solid nights. Not to take the cub anywhere, not to eat it, but to keep it alive. Close enough to read, in the whole frozen tableau of that canyon, a thing that made no sense at all. Because a saber would never do that. That was the entire heart of it. That was the thing. In all their long evolution, in all the cold logic that had built them into the perfect hunters of that perfect freezing hell, no saber had ever once burned its own strength down to nothing to protect a weakness that was not its own blood. And this thing, this soft, warm, 2-legged thing dying against the ice, had done exactly that, for a cub that wasn't even its own kind. It had spent everything. Down to the last round. down past the last round, to the bent rail and the failing hands. It had thrown the whole of its strength after what should have been, by every law the pack knew, a lost cause not even worth the spending. And the lost cause was alive, warm, fed, standing up on the sledge and warbling at the old scarred male in the dark. They did not have a frame for it. They had no place to put it. I had done, without meaning to and without understanding it myself until much later, the one single thing the pack could not comprehend. I had sacrificed strength to protect weakness, and the weakness had lived, and the math of that act did not exist anywhere in the entire cold arithmetic that had made them what they were. It was not that they forgave me. Forgiveness is a human word, and there was nothing human in that canyon but me. It was that I had shown them a kind of strength their world had never once contained, and they did not know what to do with it except stop. The old male looked at me for a long, long time. I made myself meet his eyes because I had nothing left to do anything else with no rounds, no plan, no strength, only the bent rail and the will to keep my feet between him and the sledge. So I held his gaze, the way you hold the gaze of a thing that is going to kill you, out of the last stubborn refusal to look away first. And then the old male made a sound I had never once heard from any of them in all those nights, low and long and rolling, with the warble buried somewhere down inside it. And the cub answered him. And the old male turned, unhurried, and walked back to the 5 waiting at the canyon mouth, and the 6 of them melted back out into the dark exactly the way they had come, and the canyon was empty, and I was alive, and I did not understand any of it. They didn't take the cub. I have turned that over more than anything else, and I think, and this is the part that sounds like a fairy tale when I say it aloud, the part I can't prove and never will, I think they understood that the cub was warm because of me, that the cub was alive because of the warm thing standing between it and them, and that taking it back there, that night in that cold, would have undone the very thing the warm thing had spent itself to do. I think the pack ran its cold arithmetic one final time, and the answer came back, for the first time in the history of their kind, different than it had ever come back before. The cub lived if it stayed warm. The warm thing was me. And so they left the cub with the warm thing, and they kept their distance. And through all the rest of that brutal grinding migration season, the weeks of dragging the sledge across the cracking shelf toward the one emergency beacon I'd managed to raise from the wreck of the survey sled, there was always, at the very edge of my heat vision, a shape, packing parallel to us in the dark, keeping pace, keeping watch. They escorted us out. I am as certain of that as I am of anything I have ever known. 6 sabers became 5 as the season thinned them, 5 became 3, and the 3 paced the ridgelines on either side of my route, keeping the smaller scavengers and the lesser things off us, never closing the distance, never once leaving it. I would wake from an hour's stolen frozen sleep, and find saber tracks pressed into the snow in a wide protective arc around the sledge, a perimeter walked in the night by something that could have ended me in a heartbeat and chose, every night, not to. I would crest a pressure ridge in the gray dawn, and see the old male's scarred fang catching the dying sunline a kilometer off, sitting on his haunches, watching the way you watch a thing you've taken responsibility for. They did not become tame. They did not become friends. They were exactly as alien on the last day as they had been on the first. I never once made the mistake of thinking otherwise. But somewhere in the wreck of those canyons, I had shown them a strength their whole world had never held, and they had decided, in whatever way such a thing decides anything, that the cub and its warm 2-legged thing were under the protection of the pack, until the warm thing got the cub somewhere it would not freeze. The evac skiff that finally answered my beacon found me on the lip of a glacier at the very end of the season, more dead than alive. The cub lashed to my chest because by then I couldn't drag the sledge any further. The pilot told me later after that as they came in low and loud over the ice, 3 sabers had stood up out of the white around my position, looked at the skiff with its noise and its lights, and then simply turned and walked away into the migration, unhurried, untroubled. The pilot thought they'd been stalking me, hunting the dying woman on the glacier. He couldn't for the life of him understand why I laughed until the laughing turned into something that wasn't laughing at all when he said it. I couldn't explain it to him. I'm not certain I can explain it now. They wanted to take the cub for study, of course. The company. The same company that had put 40 of us on bad ice for a vein of ore, that had darted a mother saber for a specimen and gotten her drowned and her young orphaned for the trouble. They had forms. They had a containment protocol with a number. They explained it to me very reasonably, in a warm room that smelled of recycled air and coffee, that the cub was company property, recovered from a company sled, and that while my attachment was understandable given the circumstances of my ordeal, it was not, in the end, relevant to the disposition of an asset. I let them get all the way to the end of the speech. I'd learned patience in the canyons. Then I told them what I had seen out on the shelf, the packing escort, the protective arcs walked in the night, the old male sitting on the ridgeline in the dawn light, watching. I told them that the cub was very far from the last saber they were going to be dealing with on Caro's shelf, that the company meant to be on that moon for decades pulling ore out from under the ice, and that the pack out there now knew exactly, precisely, what the warm two-legged things were capable of, knew it in a way no briefing and no specimen ever could have taught them. And I told them they could let me carry the cub back out onto the ice myself, on my own legs, and set it down where the pack could find it, or they could spend the next 30 years finding out what an apex pack predator species does once it has finally, for the first time in its entire evolution, learned a new kind of arithmetic from us. I don't know whether they believed a word of it. I think, in the end, they simply didn't want the paperwork that a dead medic and a missing asset would generate. They let me go. I carried the cub back out onto the shelf one last time at the leading edge of the next season, when the ice was firming up again and the migration was turning back toward the high country. It was bigger by then, heavier in my arms, the fangs longer and surer, the eyes gone from that clear hard blue to a deep steady gold. It didn't cry anymore. It hadn't cried in a long time. It rode against my chest the way it had that very first frozen night in the wreck of the sled, and I felt the old familiar warble come up through my ribs, and I walked out to where the white opened up wide and clean, and I knelt down, and I set it on the ice, and I stepped back. The old male came out of the dark to meet us, scarred fang, patient gold eyes. He stopped 10 meters off, exactly as he had in the canyon, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and we had the whole of our wordless conversation over again without a single sound passing between us. The cub looked back at me once, only once, over its shoulder. Then it crossed the open ice to the old male, unhurried, sure of itself, and the two of them turned together, and they walked out into the white, and the cold in the distance took them, and they were gone. I stood there a long time in the cold I'd been taught was just weather. I thought about Das and the flat of his hand against my back. I thought about the 40 funerals the company still owed and would never in this life pay. I thought about the strange fact that the only thing on that entire dying moon which had ever truly understood what I'd done in those canyons was a species I had been sent there to study, to capture, to fear, and if the orders had read a little differently, to kill. People ask me, sometimes, the very few I have ever told, what the point of it was. One medic, one cub, one pack, on a frontier moon at the edge of nowhere that nobody upsystem will ever remember the name of. They want it to have meant something larger than itself. They want a clean lesson they can carry home. Here is the only one I have ever managed to find in it. They built those sabers to never spend more than a thing was worth, to never break off a hunt, to never, ever throw good strength after a lost cause, and it made them perfect, the most perfect hunters I have ever seen or ever will. It also made them, in the final accounting, smaller than us. Because the one single thing they could not do, the thing that lay entirely outside the whole cold logic that built them, was the thing Das did with the last second of his life, and the thing I did with my last round in a blue canyon, and the thing every one of those 40 people would have done without a second's hesitation if the ice had only given them the chance. We will burn ourselves all the way down to the ground to protect something weak that isn't even ours. It makes no sense. It is the worst arithmetic there is. It loses every time on paper. And it is the most human thing in the universe. And on a dying moon at the very edge of the cold and the dark, it was enough, just barely, at the cost of nearly everything I had, to teach a thing older and stronger and stranger than me that there are kinds of strength its entire world had never once dared to imagine. I still feel that warble come up through my ribs some nights in the dark just before sleep. I hope, wherever he is now, out on the white under that dying sun, the old male is keeping it warm.